Welcome. Before you settle in, take a deep breath and get comfortable. Tonight, we're going to venture into a world where the boundaries between nightmare and reality blur, where fear lurks in the darkest corners, and shadow whisper your name. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock, marking the passage of time in the stillness of the night. Sarah lay in her bed, the faint light from the moon casting long shadows across the room. The air was cool, and the wind whispered outside, a calming breeze that should have soothed her into sleep. But tonight, Sarah felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, something she couldn't quite place, but it made her restless. She had been here before, in this very moment, tired, yet unable to sleep. Her mind wandered, drifting from one thought to the next, but always returning to the same unsettling place. The dreams. The dreams that had haunted her for weeks now. They had started quietly at first, just fleeting images in the dark corners of her mind. But over time, they had become more vivid, more real. Tonight, as Sarah lay staring at the ceiling, she tried to tell herself it was just another restless night. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, the way the air seemed to grow colder, the way the shadows in the corners of the room felt like they were waiting for her to close her eyes. And then, as if on cue, she finally drifted off into sleep. It was never a peaceful sleep. She always felt the shift, the moment when the boundary between the waking world and the dream world blurred. 1 minute, she was in her bed, lying still, and the next, she was somewhere else entirely, a place that didn't exist in the real world, but felt as real as anything she had ever known. The dream was always the same. She stood in a dark, empty room. The walls were cold, the air thick with a strange, almost suffocating stillness. There were no windows, no doors. Only the faintest light from above, flickering and casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the floor. Sarah took a step forward, her breath shallow and quick, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't know why she was here, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her. Her eyes scanned the room, trying to find something, anything, that might explain where she was. But the room remained empty, save for the shadows that danced on the walls. The silence was broken only by the soft echo of her own footsteps, which seemed too loud in the quiet of the space. She tried to move, but her legs felt heavy, as though something was holding her back. And then, she heard it. A whisper. So soft at first that she thought it might have been her imagination. But the voice came again, this time clearer, more distinct. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was something about it that made Sarah's blood run cold. She turned around, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. In the far corner of the room stood a figure, tall and dark, his features obscured by the shadows. She couldn't make out his face, but she could feel his eyes on her, eyes that seemed to pierce through her, reading her every thought, every fear. The figure stepped forward, his movement smooth and unnerving. His smile was the first thing Sarah noticed, wide and unsettling. It seemed too large, too perfect, like something out of a nightmare. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, to demand answers. But the words caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as if something was holding her in place, trapping her in the room with him. The man took another step toward her, his smile never faltering. He stopped just a few feet away, and for a long moment, Sarah was frozen, unable to do anything but stare. "You've seen me before," he said, his voice like a caress, but laced with something darker. "I've been with you for a long time." His words echoed in her mind, sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't understand. She had never seen this man before, not in her waking life. But something about him, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, made her feel as though he had been with her for far longer than she cared to admit. "Who are you?" Sarah finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure's smile widened, his eyes glinting with an unsettling familiarity. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, and Sarah instinctively took a step back, though she knew there was nowhere to go. "You already know," he said, his voice barely a whisper now, though it felt like it was all around her, inside her mind. "You've always known." As he spoke, the room seemed to close in around her. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the air growing thicker, heavier. Sarah's breath quickened as she tried to step back, to get away, but her legs refused to move. The figure continued to approach, and every inch he came closer seemed to bring with it a suffocating weight, as though the very air itself was pressing against her. And then, in a sudden, terrifying motion, the figure reached out and touched her. His hand was cold, impossibly cold, and as it made contact with her skin, a sharp, overwhelming jolt of fear surged through her. It was as though the touch had awakened something deep within her, something ancient, something dark. "You can't escape me," the figure whispered, his voice almost tender. "I've always been here, Sarah. I've always been inside your dreams." And with that, the world around her began to blur, the room dissolving into darkness, the figure's presence lingering like a shadow in the very corners of her mind. Sarah awoke with a start, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up quickly, her body trembling, her hands slick with sweat. The room was silent, still. The familiar sights of her bedroom greeted her, but the sense of unease lingered, settling over her like a heavy blanket. She glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. The same time as every night. The dream. It was always the same, yet tonight, it felt different. This time, the man, John, had seemed more real than ever before. His eyes, his voice, they stayed with her, even now, as if they were etched into her very soul. She looked around the room again, almost expecting to see him standing in the shadows, watching her. But there was nothing. Just the quiet stillness of her own home. Still, the feeling of his presence lingered, a haunting sensation that refused to leave. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to shake off the fear, but she couldn't. She couldn't escape it. He was here. And he knew her. Sarah's days had become like shadows of one another, stretching endlessly under the weight of her growing unease. Each morning, she woke with the remnants of the night still clinging to her, like a dark veil that refused to lift. The dreams, the nightmares, were relentless, each one more vivid than the last. John, the figure that had appeared in her sleep, was always there, his presence so real it was as if he were in the room with her even when she was wide awake. It was becoming harder to ignore. The fleeting moments of fear that gripped her in the quiet corners of her day, the feeling of being watched, even when no one was near, had begun to seep into her waking life. She could no longer separate the dream from reality. The line between the two worlds felt blurry, fragile, as though it might shatter at any moment. Each night, as Sarah tried to fall asleep, she would lie still in her bed, her eyes wide open, her heart pounding with anticipation. Would tonight be the night she saw him again? Would he appear in her dreams, waiting in the shadows? She didn't know. But she could feel it in the air, something was coming. Something dark and heavy, like a storm on the horizon, ready to descend upon her. And then, one night, it came. Sarah drifted into a restless sleep, the weight of the day finally giving way to exhaustion. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The air was cool, almost chilling, as if something was waiting, hidden in the dark. Her eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, she thought she might find a moment of peace, a night free from the looming presence of the man named John. But when her eyes closed, the world around her began to shift. She was standing in a room, not unlike the one from her previous dreams. It was dark, oppressive, the kind of darkness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. The room was familiar in a way she couldn't quite place, as if she had been here before, though she couldn't remember when. She took a hesitant step forward, her breath shallow. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as though the very space around her was charged with a presence, something invisible, yet palpable. Sarah's fingers brushed against the cold walls, her fingertips brushing the rough texture of stone. The shadows seemed to shift, and then, just as before, she heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, clearer. Louder. You know who I am. The voice was smooth, almost comforting, yet it sent a chill straight down Sarah's spine. It was the same voice. The same one she had heard in her nightmares before. But this time, it was real. It was in her mind, in her ears, wrapping around her thoughts like a dark thread. She turned, searching the room, but there was no one there. The shadows clung to every corner, but the space was empty. She felt a strange compulsion, a pull, as if something, or someone, was drawing her closer to the center of the room. And then she saw him. John. He was standing there, in the far corner of the room, just as he had been in her previous dreams. His tall figure seemed to blend into the darkness, his face hidden in shadow, yet his eyes, those eyes, shone through the gloom. They were watching her. Always watching her. She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her feet wouldn't move. She was trapped, suspended in the grip of fear. "You've been waiting for me," John's voice whispered, though his lips didn't move. It was as if the words were spoken directly into her mind, bypassing her ears altogether. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only stare into the dark pools of his eyes, feeling his gaze digging deeper and deeper into her soul. It was as though he could see everything, every secret, every fear, every thought she had ever buried. Suddenly, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing around her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. She felt suffocated, as if the very air was thick with something ancient, something that had no place in the world of the living. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat tight with fear. John's smile appeared from the darkness. It was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face, and his teeth glistened in the faint light. His eyes never left hers. "You've always known me, Sarah," he replied, his voice calm, almost soothing. But the words sent a jolt of terror through her. How could he know her? How could he say that? She had never seen him before, never met him in her waking life. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. His smile only widened. "I am your shadow," he said softly. "I've always been here. I've been inside your dreams, inside your mind. And now, I'm closer than ever." As the words left his mouth, the room seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching, twisting like living things. The very air grew colder, as if the temperature had dropped impossibly low. Sarah could feel a frost creeping up her arms, could feel the ice inside her chest, spreading, freezing her heart. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The dreams. The feeling of being watched. The presence that haunted her, even when she was awake. It wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. John, he was real. He was something else, something far older, far darker than anything she could comprehend. The room shifted again, blurring into something unfamiliar. The shadows melted away, and suddenly, she was standing in a different place altogether, a forest. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches stretching overhead like dark fingers, blocking out the sky. The ground beneath her feet was cold and damp, the air thick with mist. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was John. But this time, something was different. His smile had faded, replaced with something else, something darker. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling hunger, as if he were waiting for something. "Come closer," he whispered, his voice like a caress, but laced with something far more sinister. Sarah didn't want to move. She wanted to turn and run, to escape the nightmare, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the words almost lost in the cold wind that now stirred the trees. John took a step forward, his figure towering over her. His smile returned, twisted and unnatural. "You were chosen," he replied. "You've always been a part of this. This isn't just a dream, Sarah. This is real. I've always been here, watching, waiting." Before she could react, before she could even take another breath, the world around her shattered into darkness, the ground beneath her feet giving way. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was John's voice, calm and certain. "I know you, Sarah. I've always known you." Sarah awoke with a start, gasping for air. Her body was drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar surroundings of her bedroom greeted her, but the feeling of dread lingered, as if the dream had never truly ended. She sat up, staring at the walls, the shadows that danced in the corners of her room seeming darker than before. The clock on her nightstand read 3:15 a.m. The same time as always. She wasn't sure how long she had been awake, but the fear clung to her like a second skin. It was more than just a dream. John wasn't just a figure in her sleep. He was something else, something that had crossed over, something that was now with her, watching her, waiting. She looked around the room once more, half expecting to see him standing in the corner, his eyes watching her every move. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of the night. But Sarah knew. John was real. And he was closer than ever before. Sarah had never felt the weight of her own thoughts quite like this before. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, the shadows longer, the silence louder. Every night, John's presence crept closer, edging out the safe, peaceful sleep she once knew, replacing it with something far darker. Something more suffocating. It had been 2 weeks since she first saw him in her dreams. 2 weeks since John had made himself known to her, and each night had become more intense than the last. The line between sleep and wakefulness was starting to blur, and Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that she wasn't truly alone in the room anymore. Even when her eyes were open, she felt watched, always watched, by those unseen eyes. But there was something new now. Something far more terrifying than anything she had encountered before. It was those eyes. The eyes of John. Every night, when she closed her eyes, his gaze would find her, cold and unblinking. They weren't just eyes, they were a presence, a weight that pressed down on her chest, a force that drew her in, pulling her deeper into the darkness. It was as though those eyes could see into her very soul, reading every secret she had, every fear she held close. The worst part. They followed her, even when she wasn't dreaming. The moonlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting faint patterns of light and shadow across Sarah's bedroom. She had just turned off the lamp and pulled the covers tightly around her, trying to calm the racing of her heart. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, like a weight on her chest. She closed her eyes, attempting to focus on her breathing, willing herself to relax. But there it was again, a faint, nagging sensation, like someone standing just out of sight. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. He's here. He's always here. Sarah couldn't escape it anymore. Even in the daylight, even when she was surrounded by people, the feeling never left. His presence lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her vision, and every time she tried to shake it, it only seemed to grow stronger. She turned over in bed, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't silence. She thought of the people she'd seen online, the ones who, like her, had reported seeing him in their dreams. They all said the same thing, John's eyes. Those eyes that never blinked, never turned away, always watching. It was as if they could see into your deepest fears, your darkest thoughts. And Sarah knew, deep down, that no matter how hard she tried to fight it, John was no longer just a figure in her sleep. He was real, he had crossed into her waking world. Her eyes fluttered shut, and the familiar darkness swallowed her whole. This time, when Sarah found herself in the dream, it wasn't the same dark, oppressive room as before. No. This time, it was different. The world around her was empty, nothing but an endless, barren expanse of fog, stretching in all directions. The air was thick and heavy, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft, like sand, but she couldn't see anything. It was as if the fog had swallowed everything, every landmark, every sound. And then, she heard it, the softest whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. You can't hide from me. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It was John's voice, soft and cold, like a whisper in her very soul. Slowly, she turned around. And there he was. John. But this time, there was something different about him. His figure was blurred, like he was made of smoke, his edges never quite defined. And yet, his eyes, they were crystal clear. piercing. In the swirling mist, they were the only thing that stood out, gleaming like cold, lifeless stars in the blackened sky. Sarah felt her heart pound in her chest as his eyes locked onto hers. Those eyes, those deep, endless eyes, held her in place, unable to look away. It was as though his gaze was a force in itself, an invisible hand gripping her throat, holding her there, frozen. "You can't escape," John whispered, his voice sending chills through her, even as it reverberated inside her mind. For a moment, Sarah tried to move, to run. But her legs refused to obey. She felt trapped, ensnared by those eyes. They were everywhere, even in the fog, even in the shadows, like they were seeping into every corner of her mind, consuming her from the inside out. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. John's figure stepped closer, and with each step, the fog thickened, the world growing darker. "I am a part of you," he said, his voice strangely calm, as if he were stating a simple fact. "You invited me in the moment you began to fear me." "No," Sarah protested, her voice weak. "I didn't." "Yes, you did," he interrupted, his smile widening, revealing a glimpse of his teeth, sharp and glinting in the dim light. His eyes, those eyes, never wavered from hers. "Every time you woke up, you were searching for me. Every time you closed your eyes, you wanted to see me. You wanted to know why I was here. And now, you'll never be rid of me." Sarah's breath quickened. She tried to look away, but it was impossible. Those eyes, they held her, pinned her in place. She was unable to move, unable to speak, as though she were caught in the gaze of something ancient, something unfatho. "You see," John continued, his voice growing softer, more intimate. "There's no escape from me. I've always been here, lurking in the dark corners of your mind. Waiting for you to notice. And now that you have, I'll never leave." The fog thickened, and Sarah could feel her surroundings closing in, pressing against her, suffocating her. The last thing she saw before the dream began to shatter was his eyes, those cold, endless eyes, staring into hers with such intensity that it felt as though they were burning into her very soul. Sarah awoke with a sudden jolt, gasping for breath, her body covered in a cold sweat. The room was dark, just as it had been when she fell asleep, but the silence felt louder now. The oppressive feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating, like it had followed her back from the dream. Her heart raced in her chest, and she sat up in bed, looking around frantically. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed deeper than usual, stretching and shifting, as though they were alive. Was he here? Watching her? And then, just as she thought the fear might consume her entirely, she saw it, a faint reflection in the window. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there it was. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing just outside her window, staring in. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. John's eyes. They were staring at her through the glass. And in that moment, she knew, the nightmare had followed her. John wasn't just a figment of her imagination anymore. He was real. And he was watching her, even when she was awake. The morning light came too quickly for Sarah. It felt as if the darkness of the night had never truly left her, clinging to her skin like the chill of the air. Each day now, she woke with an unsettling sense of déjà vu, as if the nightmares were folding into reality, leaving behind a trail of fear that she couldn't escape. John's eyes still lingered in her thoughts, those cold, unblinking eyes that haunted her every waking moment. Every night, as Sarah lay in bed, trying to close her eyes, she felt the suffocating presence of the man she had once only seen in her dreams. She could no longer deny it, John was real. And no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, there was something more to him. Something that tied him to her, something that made her feel like she had always known him, even before he appeared. But she had to understand why. She had to know how this began. The questions gnawed at her, louder than the fear itself. How had she become a part of his world? And why did she feel so connected to him, as though there was an invisible thread that bound them together? Sarah knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find answers. The first thing Sarah did was turn to the internet. She searched for everything she could about John, but found nothing. At least, nothing that made sense. There were vague references to strange nightmares, to people reporting the same unsettling figure appearing in their dreams, but no definitive answers. No pattern. No explanations. The more she searched, the more she realized how deeply she was tied to something beyond her understanding, something that stretched far beyond a simple nightmare. As she scrolled through page after page, she stumbled upon a forum thread that caught her attention. The title was chilling, "The Man in the Shadows, a Global Nightmare." Her pulse quickened as she clicked on the link, her eyes scanning the first few posts. One user wrote, "I saw him last night. Same figure. Same face. Same eyes. I don't know how, but I think he's been following me for years. I've seen him in my dreams since I was a child. But now, it's different. He's here, in my waking life. I can feel him watching me, always." Another post followed, "He's not just a dream. He's something more. I can't explain it, but it's like he knows me. Knows everything about me. I can feel his eyes on me even when I'm awake." The names on the posts were unfamiliar to Sarah, but the stories sounded eerily familiar. People were describing the same figure, John. They had seen him in their sleep, and now, just like Sarah, they were feeling his presence even when they were awake. The same cold, relentless gaze. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. How could this be happening to so many people? It was as if they were all experiencing the same nightmare, and somehow, John was at the center of it. The connection was undeniable. There were a few other posts she read, some claiming to have figured it out. They talked about John as if he were a legend, a being who existed between the realms of the living and the dead, someone who could enter dreams and linger in the waking world. But none of it made sense. None of it answered the question of why he had come after her. Then she came across something that made her blood run cold. A post titled, "The John Files, An Ancient Presence." It was a story from someone who claimed to have studied John for years, piecing together the scattered accounts of those who had encountered him. According to this user, John wasn't just a figment of imagination. He was an entity, something far older than humanity itself. Something tied to the deepest fears and darkest corners of the mind. The post read, "John is a manifestation of fear, an entity that feeds off the energy of those who are vulnerable. He doesn't just appear in dreams, he chooses people. People with fear deep in their hearts. He gets inside their minds, twists their thoughts, and brings their worst nightmares to life. The more you fear him, the stronger he becomes. And once he's chosen you, there's no escape. You'll never be free from him." The words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. This wasn't just some psychological phenomenon. This was something far worse. And the worst part was, it made sense. She had always felt the fear growing inside her, the sense that something was watching, waiting. And now it was all real. She had to know more. She had to understand why this was happening to her. If there was any chance of escaping John, she needed to learn everything she could about him. But where to start? Her mind raced with questions, each one more pressing than the last. What did it mean for her to be chosen by him? Was there a way to stop him? Could she sever the connection, break free from his grip? The answers were unclear, but Sarah knew that if she didn't act soon, she might lose herself to him entirely. The search for answers took Sarah to the library. The musty smell of old books filled the air as she wandered through the aisles, her mind consumed by the fear of what she might find. She sifted through books on folklore, legends, and paranormal occurrences, looking for any clue, anything that might help her understand the entity she was up against. As she flipped through the pages of one particularly old tome, a passage caught her eye. It was buried deep within the pages, almost like it had been deliberately hidden. It was about a being known as the Watcher. The description was brief, but chilling. The Watcher was said to be an ancient entity that existed outside the realm of death, feeding off the fear of the living. It was a shapeshifter, capable of taking on any form, any face. It could enter the dreams of its victims, appearing as someone they knew, or as an unknown figure. The watcher thrived on fear, feeding on it until its victim was consumed, leaving only despair behind. The passage ended with a warning: those who encounter the watcher are never the same. The fear never fades. The watcher follows them, not just in their dreams, but in their waking life as well. There is no escape. Only silence, until the end. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The description matched everything she had experienced. The figure in her dreams. The unrelenting gaze. The suffocating fear. John was the watcher. And she had become its prey. That night, as Sarah sat in her apartment, staring at the pages of the book, she felt it again. That familiar sensation. The feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a cold draft against her neck, but then it grew stronger. She could feel it, all around her, his presence. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone, determined to find something, anything, that would help her understand how to stop him. She was no longer sure she could. But as she swiped through her messages, her heart stopped. There, on her phone, was a new notification. A message from an unknown number. It simply read, "I see you." And Sarah knew, deep in her bones, that it was John. His eyes were watching her once again. The days had blurred into each other, and Sarah's mind felt as if it were unraveling. The more she learned about John, the more she realized the horror she was facing. The lines between dream and reality had dissolved completely. She could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The suffocating feeling of being watched never left her, and every waking moment was haunted by the cold weight of John's presence. She had scoured every corner of the internet, searched through old tomes, and even reached out to others who shared her nightmare. All the while, John's cold eyes watched, unblinking, never letting her escape. It was as if the more she sought answers, the tighter his grip on her became. She knew she couldn't run forever. There was only one option left. She had to confront him. Sarah had no illusions about what would happen if she failed. The warnings were clear: those who encountered the watcher never escaped. Once chosen, there was no way out. But she couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't let fear control her any longer. It was a moonless night when Sarah made her decision. She had spent the entire evening preparing herself. Mentally, emotionally, though she knew it would never be enough. The fear would be overwhelming, just as it had been in her dreams. But this time, she would face it. She would face him. She sat in the center of her apartment, the lights dimmed, the air thick with tension. Her heart hammered in her chest as she closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She could already feel the pull, the familiar sensation of his presence creeping into the room like a shadow. the temperature dropped, and the silence deepened. Then, it happened. The whisper. Soft at first, barely audible. "I see you." Her blood ran cold. The voice was familiar now, too familiar. It was John, speaking from the depths of her mind. His voice filled her head, a quiet but powerful presence that seemed to invade every thought. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as his words surrounded her. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, this time closer, like he was right next to her. "I've been waiting. You can't hide from me. You never could." The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, swirling around her, closing in. Her pulse quickened, but she held her ground. She knew she couldn't let fear control her. Not now. She took a deep breath and whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know what you are, John. You're not just a nightmare. You're an ancient entity. A being of fear. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. I won't let you consume me." There was a long silence, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought maybe, just maybe, she had broken free. But then, the temperature dropped even further, and the air grew heavy with the presence of something dark, something ancient. The shadows thickened, and from the darkness, a figure began to emerge. John. He appeared as he always did in her dreams, tall, obscured in shadow, but his eyes were the only thing that stood out. They gleamed like frozen pools of blackness, endless and void-like. They stared at her with cold intensity, seeing through her, into her very soul. "You think you can stop me?" John's voice was no longer a whisper but a cold, mocking tone that filled the room. "You are mine now. Your fear feeds me. You can't escape that." Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't look away. His eyes, the thing that had haunted her, the thing that had controlled her, she would not let them control her any longer. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering every ounce of courage she had left. When she opened them again, she stood up, facing him head-on, refusing to let him dominate her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the force of his presence pressing down on her, but she refused to show fear. "You feed on fear, John," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm not afraid of you anymore. I see you for what you are. You are nothing but a reflection of the fear in my mind, and I'm not giving you that power anymore." The shadows around John flickered for a moment, as if they were unsure of what to do. He took a step forward, his form becoming clearer, but he didn't move any closer. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and a cold smile spread across his face. "You think you've won? You think you can stand against me? I am your fear. I am inescapable. No matter how hard you try, you can never escape me." But Sarah was unwavering. She took another step forward, her heart still pounding but no longer controlled by fear. "You're wrong," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of everything she had learned. "You are nothing without me. You're a shadow, a reflection of the darkness in my mind. You're a nightmare, and all nightmares eventually fade." The air around her seemed to crackle with energy as she spoke. The shadows flickered again, and for the first time, John hesitated. Sarah felt it then, something shifting, a crack in his hold on her. The fear that had once consumed her began to dissipate, fading like fog in the morning sun. "You have no power here," Sarah whispered, her voice firm and full of conviction. "I will no longer let you control me. I will not be your prisoner." John's eyes widened for a brief moment, and then, as quickly as he had appeared, his form began to dissipate, his presence weakening, fading into the shadows. His mocking smile vanished, replaced by a look of surprise and uncertainty. For the first time since he had entered her life, Sarah felt him retreat. Slowly, he dissolved into nothingness, like smoke in the wind, leaving behind only the remnants of his presence, faint, almost imperceptible, like a memory on the edge of her mind. And then, there was silence. Complete silence. The oppressive weight that had followed Sarah for so long lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The darkness that had haunted her, that had threatened to consume her, was gone. The nightmare was over. Sarah woke up the next morning, the soft sunlight filtering through the blinds. The air felt lighter, fresher. The apartment, once suffocating with the shadows of fear, now felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in days, Sarah didn't feel the oppressive weight of John's presence. She felt safe. But as she stretched, ready to start her day, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from an unknown number. Sarah hesitated for a moment, feeling a sense of dread claw at her chest. She opened the message. It was a single image. A grainy, black and white photo of her bedroom. The bed was empty, but the shadows around it were thick, almost alive, curling in unnatural ways, as if they were trying to form something. The caption read, "I see you, Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat, and the phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. She backed away from it, her heart racing. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, as if responding to the message. She turned quickly, trying to shake off the feeling, but when she glanced into the mirror on the wall, her reflection wasn't quite right. In the dim light, it was almost indistinguishable, but just for a split second, she saw it, there, in the reflection. The dark figure. John. His cold eyes stared back at her, and for the briefest moment, his smile curled across his lips. But then, just as quickly, it disappeared, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence. The room went deathly still, and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She wasn't alone. Not anymore.